Well, thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Nicole, for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to be part of this conversation today. This is really exciting. And indeed, I'm going to be digging into climate history because I'm going to take you basically, can you hear me okay? Sure. I'm going to take you back to the days of the ancient Romans, no less, in an effort to evaluate the issue of cultural responses to climate and ecology crises and downturns. And I'd like to to address this issue at both a global and local level, very much with a view toward investigating a mentality, sort of like a decision making and a modus operandi that indeed are very, very Roman. So I'm going to start by sort of presenting a beautiful engraving of the site that I'm going to bring into focus, a site called Cosa. But let me start by premising this conversation with sort of an assessment of the Romans as sort of as they handled ecological downturns and sort of like how they interacted with their surroundings. Now, when it comes down to non-environmentally friendly behavior, the Romans indeed deserve the badge of honor. In particular, I'd like to focus on metallurgy. It is an industry that under the Romans is of interest, especially for the massive emissions from the mining and smelting of lead and silver. Now, Greenland and the Romans, that don't really make much sense together, but they actually do, because a recent project measured lead levels along a roughly 400-meter cross-section of Greenland ice with layers between 1100 BC and 800 AD. The outcome of that is a 1900 years timeline of basically European lead emissions. And it's interesting to see how these emissions very much sort of varied and coincided alternatively with historical events, including the imperial expansion, wars, and major plagues. For instance, emissions rose coeval with Phoenician expansion sometime in around 900, 800 BC. They accelerated during the expanded Carthaginian and Roman mining activities, especially in the Iberian Peninsula. And then these emissions, they reached a maximum under the Roman Empire. Emissions fluctuating in sync with wars and political instability, particularly during the Roman Republic, and plunged coincident with two major plagues in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and then sort of like kind of remained pretty low in the successive 500 years. So, of course, an industry of this sort that produces this amount of emission needs to be driven by a lot of like labor, energy, know-how, and the entire infrastructure that very much sort of becomes like, the engine of this thing. Of course, it is well known, but speaking of resources, we have to very much sort of put in the equation the impact of this kind of industries, and especially sort of like in order to sort of like produce metals, you have to burn a lot of wood. So deforestation is a major issue when it comes down to sort of like the assessment of the impact of the Romans on especially European and Middle Eastern landscapes. And of course, the deforestation comes with a package and sort of like with a cascade of other sort of like negative elements, erosion, degradation of soil, and what have you. But it's interesting because I'd like to focus on the idea that smelting operations entail the destruction of very vast tracts of forests and woods all over Europe. And the site here of Populonia is a good case in point. It is a gripping example of a well, do I have a pointer? No, but come up with something. This is the site in object where We're here on the Tuscan seaboard. And this is a site that basically received all the metal ores from the Elba Island and basically processed all these tons of materials. Great. It's interesting because this kind of industry spearheaded the genesis and development of a vast network of small sites. But more interesting, the ecological impact of these sites needs to be brought into sharper focus because pollen analysis and charcoal data, they show the wholesale disappearance of an entire species of trees. Elk, quercus, deciduous taxa in general, they all disappeared at the expense of of shrubs, maquis, and the typical canopy that we file under the rubric of Macchia mediterranea. And here you get a sense of the dissemination, the explosion of all these sites that were very much integrated in this network of metallurgy that indeed led to the destruction and transformation in fundamental ways of an entire tract of a landscape. But in terms of what I'm interested in addressing here today is very much the Roman mentality and the similar way with which the Romans actually addressed problems that were related to, again, ecological downturns, crises, droughts, lack of water. Here's a good example. This is actually an arresting example of the kind of things that the Romans would do in terms of, say, draining basins, diverting rivers, and playing with water, but in ways that very much exceed not only a calculation of the costs, but also rationale. Why would you basically go out of your way and splurge all of these energies? Here's an example again of a lake poised in central Italy, the Fucine Lake, also known as the Fucino, in the red rectangle. There you go. Now, if you were to look that one up on a Google Earth map or whatever, the lake is no more. And in lieu of the lake is a fertile and rather flat and extraordinary plain that, of course, is very much conducive to settlement and agriculture and what have you. This was literally, this plain is the cultural response to a moment of drought, to the necessity to to water territories nearby that has greatly suffered from a moment of drought. Hence, the Emperor Claudius decided to basically come to terms with it and use basically the iron fist in the sense of the over-the-top response. Over-the-top responses, however, are global when it comes to the Romans, whether it's Italy, in the vicinity of Rome, or say in eastern Turkey, the former province of Syria. The methodologies and the approach and the mentality are the same. Here you're looking at a stunning tunnel, Titus Tunnel in Samandağ, Turkey. This is the region of Hatay, and that is indeed the tunnel of the Emperor Titus, a tunnel 2 miles long that literally diverted a river just because the river was too close to the town and the river had the propensity to flood. So hence, the Romans basically diverted entirely the rivers of this water. Now, in terms of this kind of responses and very Roman, of course, the Romans are not alone in this type of building, in the sense that also, do consider the Han Dynasty of China in the 2nd century BC and the kind of waterworks that greatly transformed the course of the Yangtze River. These are empires, and this is how empires deal with the resources and water, especially. But I'd like to move away from the global and this sense of the imperial project and the imperial whims that transform cities, territories, and landscapes, and rather focus on the small, the nondescript, and actually the actual local local ecology that indeed was occupied and transformed by the Romans albeit sort of like on with a certain attention to sort of like the general conditions and the development of an infrastructure that is absolutely unique. So from now on, for the rest of the remainder of my talk, I'm going to be focusing on Cosa, a site that is also located in Tuscany on the Tyrrhenian seaboard. As you can see, so the location is not too shabby. This is where, since 2013, FSU digs. Indeed, sort of like our session is called "Digging into Climate History." There you go. I mean, I'm going to be showing you some archaeological data right from the site, and I'm glad that here today is sort of like I'm with my field assistant Alison Smith and Pino Norato, who came to sort of like to be part of this. That said, sort of like responses at a local level, away from sort of like the grandeur of the emperors. So this is Cosa, and this is sort of like, well, the picture and sort of the light don't really just do justice to sort of like the setting. It's a beautiful karstic plateau that, much as it looks is sort of stunning and picturesque and what have you, all the great things and sort of like what we imagine about Tuscany. Yes, this is a good sort of like epitome of those. But this is a site that's very unpromising for settlement. It's crippled by all kinds of ecological downturns, and primarily the fact that it doesn't have a single drop of water. Not a spring, neither an aqueduct nor a spring, nothing, no sources of fresh water. The Romans decide to build a big colony here. And it's the location is ill-suited, and the plan really doesn't make much sense. And you will think, well, I mean, look at sort of like the location, and of course, the sort of Cosa is here, like I said. This is the promontory, like overlooking the Argentario Peninsula. Again, poised on this beautiful coast, sort of along the main arteries of traffic. You have all kinds of sort of like alternatives. Places that have abundant water resources and flat land, and instead sort of they settle up on top of this promontory, and it's really a bad idea. Now, I don't want to sort of like give you sort of like any kind of I don't want to really sort of linger on sort of spend too much time actually on chronologies and sort of emperors and what have you. What I'd like to convey, however, sort of like is the sense of sort of like a community that is completely dysfunctional. It starts in 273. We have the texts, the original text and inscriptions, so all the dates are pretty solid. It starts in 273 BC, but in less than a century, the place is no more. It's not functioning. I mean, like basically the Roman state has invested in this thing, but it's not working. And this is because the place has no water and there's no enough sort of like an ability to sort of withstand the actual situation. However, sort of like a century later, the political vicissitudes have changed. I mean, there are no more threats, and the Romans are conquering basically the universe. So they decide to settle again, or at least they decide to sort of like reinforce the little contingent of folks who had this, basically decided to stay. And new lymph, new transfusion of blood, and that pays dividends. Big flurry of monuments, sort of spectacular stuff, the form, all the things, the trappings that you associate to the typical Roman city, we have them at Cosa. Then 70 BC, pirates. Then sort of like it's Renaissance again, and then sort of reconstruction, and then sort of like in the 2nd century AD, sort of things start to dwindle down. So long story short, it's this ebb and flow, this continuous fluctuation, a community that tries its best to sort of like stick around, but it's always a sort of like negotiating basically their survival against, again, the forces of nature and like continuous droughts and the fact that anyways here this place doesn't have any kind of like water resources. But again, sort of like they develop sort of like their own systems in a way that I'm going to describe like in a minute. We tried also to sort of like build an ecological history for like the entire basin, and to that end we started a program of deep coring in with a view toward establishing sort of a sedimentation history of the region, especially since this region is framed by lagoons and all kinds of sort of features that indeed must have impacted sort of the human presence. And here, sort of like a sample, sort of where we are. We're still dealing with a phase and dates that are C14 dated, but proceeding long the arrival of the Romans. But in strictly cultural terms, these guys build a city. They invest a lot of resources. There's a big investment at the wrong site. So this kind of dialectic is of interest. Basically, they force sort of the local inhabitants to sort of accept a lifestyle that is complicated. Again, we assume that sort of presence of water is the conditio, the main condition. For the survival of a settlement, modern or ancient. And it seems as though sort of they're thinking that they can do it, but they really can't. And the city remains rather small. Again, within a century, sort of it almost ceases to exist. What you're looking at here is the X-ray of the city. It's not sort of the actual sort of these are not the real monuments or anything. Monuments are going to look like the weather guy. So, but this is basically the excavated area. All this white grayish blob, that is actually ground penetrating radar results. So basically what lies beneath the surface. And there are I'll give you sort of the synopsis of this. There are just basically vacuums, areas that are completely bereft of any kind of building activity whatsoever. So again, whether they were hoping to sort of to do better in the future, or simply the city sort of couldn't make it, is difficult to forecast. Of course, sort of the scholarship of the 70s and the 80s is sort of has greatly extolled this site as representative of the great things that we like about the Romans. The Romans are great and all. So Cosa was used as a blueprint for the ideal Roman city, with a grid, with temples and what have you. When in fact, as I showed you, sort of the city is probably only partially inhabited with vast sort of areas of again vacuums. And in that vein, some of the models again sort of celebrate sort of this density of settlement that didn't really exist, nor the road system cover the full extent of the city itself. Now, however, sort of I'd like to bring into focus, and again, sort of focus on for the next few minutes, is the fact that you cannot really see here, but this plan here of the city, which is again sort of the byproduct of the ground penetrating radar map, has a lot of blue dots. Each of those blue dots represents a cistern or a reservoir. So basically, these guys, they build hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cisterns, so as to collect the water that basically sort of basically stems from rain, or say they try to also impound water by building a lot of small canals. So this in essence is sort of how the city sort of survives, and it basically sort of for a good 500 years, these guys, they decided to persevere and stick around here, again in spite of all the odds, by continuing sort of the system of cisterns and making them better, bigger, and basically lining them with the sort of the kind of concrete that's going to make them impermeable. So it becomes almost like the cultural signature of this community. Sort of we build cisterns and we do them well. We stick around. We could go anywhere else, but we stay in spite again of sort of the kind of situation which is not ideal. So in keeping with this premise, we decided to sort of our group, whom I've already mentioned, and I have decided to sort of to embark on a project that sounds almost crazy, because we're investigating, we're digging this thing in yellow, which is very much the epitome of sort of the water impounding techniques at Cosa. That thing in yellow, in fact, is a bath. Now you will think, at a place that is already struggling, scrambling to put together a decent amount of water, sort of in cisterns and reservoirs, how can you possibly conceive to build a bath? It's insane. It's absolutely insane. It's like counterintuitive. It's just a sort of like a wrong idea, but they put it off. And basically we are very much sort of like in the process of gleaning the story, and this is sort of like our fabulous, well, I cannot see much of it, but it's our fabulous FSU group at work as we are unraveling this story. Like how you build a bath at a place that doesn't have water. I think here sort of like it's a story of ingenuity, a story of like engineering that is like remarkable, not just in terms of sort of like using materials and having like, the right mentality. Basically, they take bits and pieces of tunnels and cisterns and containers and piece them together. It looks very makeshift, but it works, and it works for centuries. So much as this is a crippled community, it's got all the kind of like, limitations, it also sort of decides to equip itself with a bath. It's sort of like, they decide to sort of like, to promote this plan. And the plan is of interest for basically, they literally appropriate one of the big reservoirs that had sort of like that had been intended for public use, for like, drinking water, this big container here, 700,000 liters of capacity. And they raise the floor, they tilt it, they dig a tunnel, and through this tunnel, basically, you're looking at sort of like, basically the excavation process is sort of plan. So, and everything is happening at two levels, underground and on the surface. Underground, we go from like, the reservoir. Here, there's a sluice mechanism, like a sluice gate that controls sort of the flow of water. And then gravity flow down to an existing cistern, to a shaft, water lifting device, and then distribution to the rest of the spa. Great. What is critical, however, and it matters to me more than just the sort of the technicalities and the style of construction, is this idea here, the sluice gate. These guys have no water. They control every single drop of water. They make sure that not a drop of water gets spilled because they cannot afford it. They're going to get like 3 months of rain during the year. The rainfall is anywhere between 410, 420 millimeters a year. So we're not talking about a whole lot of rain. So in order to sort of make this thing work, they have to sort of like exert most extraordinary control over like, the water they use. And consider that a bath is like the place where you basically just like, you spray people, you do crazy stuff. You just like, it's very interesting how they develop this mentality, this ability to say, this is the X amount of water that we have for today, and tomorrow we have to be really cautious. So it's management. It's sort of like knowing sort of what to expect from the general climatic overarching conditions. It's many things that transcend the discussion of the bath. Sure, this is a great Roman bath. Why not? It looks weird, but it's unique. This is sort of like, it looks confusing from the distance, but it's basically like our excavation to date with an overlap of AutoCAD drawing and drone taken imagery. It shows you basically sort of like all the features of calculation, forethought. And this is a reconstruction of sort of the section of the building from the reservoir to the tunnel to the other cistern, and then lifting device and distribution to the rest of the building. Type of technology that the project used, sort of lifting devices, the kind of technology that circulates in the Mediterranean from the 3rd century BC, if not earlier. Egypt, Middle East, those are the regions where these ideas originated. And here's a few details of sort of like some of the locales that we had the fortune to uncover, and all the beautiful buildings. The buildings that also are endowed with like the actual materials that have the signature of the makers and the actual yard bricks that produce the buildings themselves. So we have the names of basically the contractors. Isn't that great? And we can sort of like date those. So in conclusion, this is a great story, sort of like, consider sort of like, the background of sort of like, Roman politics and how sort of like, the Roman sort of like imperial house sort of like deals with, all kinds of sort of like, ecological vicissitudes. We move from the global to the local, and here we have a great story on how to not splurge a single drop of water. Make of that what you will. It's a story of ingenuity, hydraulic know-how, and savvy water management that are all like braided together in a single project. Well, it's the bath. It's sort of like as it stands is very much sort of like the pinnacle of like 500 years of like building cisterns and reservoirs and perfected them and sort of making them easier to access and sort of like more functional. So it's water harvesting at its best. An example of sustainable practices, of course, sustainability is this fuzzy concept, but I'm thinking here in terms of sort of like practices that entail the control of quality, control of like of flow, governance, and all the kind of like basic ideas that are associated to the tenet of sustainability. And I think that we all have them in place at COSE, and I think that that's, if anything, that's the main takeaway. And I thank you so very much for your attention.